People in Pine Ridge Hollow liked things uncomplicated. Modest homes, predictable routines, familiar ways of thinking. The town rested quietly between low mountain ridges in western North Carolina, the kind of place where the road seemed to narrow as you entered and only widened again when you left. Folks believed in clean lines and recognizable forms, straight fences, square walls, and simple answers to questions that were anything but simple. That was why Ethan Walker didn't quite fit. At 16, Ethan wasn't loud, and he wasn't rebellious. He stayed out of trouble. He didn't sneak around at night or challenge authority. Most days, people hardly noticed him at all, until suddenly they did. He lived alone in a worn-down trailer at the edge of town, the same one his parents had bought before they died in a winter car accident 3 years earlier. Since then, Ethan had learned to take care of himself. He cooked his own meals, split his own firewood, and stretched every dollar further than most grown men in Pine Ridge Hollow ever had to. What set him apart wasn't what he said. It was what he paid attention to. Ethan noticed how the wind curved along the slopes of the mountains instead of slamming straight through them. He studied how rain gathered at edges, how ice thickened where sharp corners met. He observed the old oak trees, rounded, weathered, bent by years of storms, still standing firm long after newer, straighter trees had cracked and fallen. While other kids spent their afternoons playing pickup basketball behind the gas station or talking about leaving town someday, Ethan sat quietly on overturned buckets, a notebook resting on his knee. He filled page after page with sketches that didn't look familiar to anyone else. Circles, arcs, curves. At school, teachers described him as quiet. His classmates called him strange. The older folks referred to him as that Walker boy, with a tone that carried more suspicion than explanation. Got his head in the clouds, some would say. Reads too much, others added. Poor kid hasn't been right since his parents passed. Maybe there was some truth in all of it, but no one ever stopped to ask why Ethan watched the world the way he did. Each night after dinner, he would reach beneath his bed and pull out a worn cardboard box. Inside were old notebooks filled with yellowed pages, tight handwriting, and careful hand-drawn diagrams. They had belonged to his father, and before that, his grandfather, a man Ethan barely remembered except for his hands. Strong, steady hands that could fix almost anything given enough time. The notebooks weren't stories or journals. They were records, observations, notes about storms, sketches of structures, clippings from old magazines covering engineering, physics, and shifting weather patterns. Ethan didn't understand every detail, but he understood enough to feel uneasy. Storms weren't the same anymore. They didn't follow the patterns people expected, and Pine Ridge Hollow wasn't prepared for that. One cold afternoon in October, while the rest of the town got ready for winter the way they always had, Ethan made a choice that quietly marked him as different for good. He began clearing a patch of land behind his trailer. It wasn't large, just a small area near the tree line where the ground rose slightly and felt firm beneath his boots. He worked methodically, pacing the space, placing small wooden stakes to mark positions. Then he brought out salvaged materials, old boards, rusted metal sheets, tools he had collected over the years by fixing and repurposing what others had thrown away. When Frank Miller, the town's longtime carpenter, drove past in his rusted pickup truck, he slowed down and stared. "What in the world are you building out here, son?" Frank called out. Ethan wiped the sweat from his forehead. "A shelter," he replied. Frank let out a short laugh, not unkind, but certain. The kind of laugh that came from believing you already knew better. "You planning to live underground or something?" "No," Ethan said, "not underground." Frank leaned forward, squinting at the layout, the odd spacing, the unfamiliar design. "Those lines don't look right." "They're not lines," Ethan said quietly. "They're guides." "For what?" Ethan hesitated. He had learned that explaining things too soon often made people stop listening entirely. "For something that won't break," he said at last. Frank shook his head with a chuckle and drove on. Kid's got an imagination, I'll give him that. In a town like Pine Ridge Hollow, word didn't take long to travel. By the end of the week, people were slowing their cars as they passed Ethan's land. Some stared openly, others whispered. A few kids laughed when they thought he couldn't hear them. "Looks like he's building a giant beehive. No, man, it's a UFO landing pod. My dad says nothing round lasts out here." Ethan heard every word. He didn't respond. He just kept working. Through cold mornings and early sunsets, he worked with raw hands and aching muscles. He studied the land, adjusted angles, and tore down sections that didn't feel right. Every decision mattered, not because he was stubborn, but because he was afraid of being wrong. Not for himself, for what might come. One evening, as the sky glowed in deep shades of orange and purple over the ridge, Lucas Reed, one of the few people in town who still spoke to Ethan without judgment, walked up and leaned against a nearby tree. "You doing okay?" Lucas asked. "People are talking." Ethan nodded slightly. "They always do."
Lucas looked over the unusual curved framework beginning to rise from the ground. "You gonna tell me what this really is?" Ethan paused. The wind shifted softly through the leaves, carrying a low, restless sound. "I'm not building for today," he said finally. "I'm building for the day when today stops making sense." Frank frowned. "You think something bad's coming?" Ethan turned his gaze toward the mountains, their rounded shapes fading into the darkening sky. "I don't know when," he said. "I just know not yet doesn't mean never." Lucas didn't laugh. He didn't argue. He just stood there, uneasy, with that quiet feeling that lingers when someone says something you can't quite shake. As the sun slipped behind the ridge, Ethan returned to his work. Alone, focused, completely out of step with the world around him. Unnoticed by most, misunderstood by many, but preparing for something no one else believed would ever happen. By mid-October, Ethan Walker's project was no longer just a curiosity. It had become entertainment. Every small town has its own rhythm, an unspoken understanding of what belongs and what doesn't. In Pine Ridge Hollow, that rhythm had been the same for generations. People built square houses because their parents had built square houses. They trusted corners, right angles, and methods that had always worked. Ethan was breaking that rhythm. The curved framework rising behind his trailer looked wrong to people. Not dangerous, not threatening, just wrong. And in places like Pine Ridge Hollow, wrong made people uncomfortable. They started stopping by uninvited. Some came pretending to be helpful. Others came because boredom needed a target. One afternoon, as Ethan rustled a heated wooden beam into place, he heard clapping behind him. "Would you look at that?" Frank Miller said, standing with two other men near the tree line. "I'll be damned, he really is serious." Ethan didn't turn around. "Kid," Frank continued louder now, "you know you're making things harder on yourself, right?" Ethan tightened the clamps and waited for the wood to cool before answering. "Harder doesn't mean weaker." That earned a laugh. "Listen to him," one of the men said. "Sounds like he swallowed a textbook." Frank shook his head, half smiling. "You trying to prove something, Ethan?" Ethan finally turned. His face was calm, but his eyes were tired. "I'm trying to build something that lasts." Frank gestured toward the town, barely visible through the trees. Those houses lasted just fine. Ethan didn't argue. He learned that arguing only hardened people's positions. Instead, he went back to his work. Frank watched for a moment longer, then sighed. "Suit yourself, son. Just don't expect folks to take you seriously." That was the problem. They already didn't. At the gas station, people talked. At his age, he should be thinking about work, not fairy tale buildings. "My cousin says round structures trap heat. Weird. Kid's gonna freeze come winter." The whispers followed Ethan everywhere, at the grocery store, at school, even at church, where people smiled kindly but kept their distance as if odd ideas might be contagious. The pressure didn't explode all at once. It pressed in slowly. Every sideways glance, every joke, every reminder that being different came with a cost. Some nights alone in his trailer, Ethan stared at the ceiling and wondered if they were right. He was exhausted, behind on stocking firewood, behind on food prep. He had one unfinished project demanding everything he had, and winter was coming fast. Fear crept in quietly. What if I'm wrong? But then he'd open his father's notebooks again. He'd see sketches of curved surfaces, notes about pressure distribution, simple observations written in careful handwriting. Force looks for edges, corners fail first. Those pages didn't promise safety.
They didn't guarantee survival. They just made sense. So Ethan kept going. The day the steam box collapsed nearly broke him. He'd spent weeks building it from scrap wood and salvaged metal, his way of bending beams without cracking them. One bad joint, one moment of impatience, and the whole thing caved in on itself with a sharp crack. Ethan sat in the dirt afterward, staring at the wreckage. His hands shook, not from cold, from doubt. That was when Lucas Reed showed up again. "Rough day?" Lucas asked quietly. Ethan let out a humorless laugh. "You could say that." Lucas crouched beside him. "You ever think about stopping?" Ethan didn't answer right away. "I think about stopping every day," he finally said. "I just think about something else more." Lucas followed his gaze to the half-built structure. The curves were unmistakable now, intentional, defiant. "What happens if nothing ever comes?" Lucas asked. "If you build all this and the bad day never shows up?" Ethan swallowed. "Then I wasted time." "And if you don't build it?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Then I might waste lives." Lucas didn't have a comeback for that. Neither did anyone else. By late October, the structure was tall enough to draw attention from across the road. Kids rode their bikes past just to stare. Adults slowed their trucks. Some people stopped laughing. They started worrying. At a town meeting, Frank Miller finally said it out loud. "That boy's building like he knows something we don't." The room went quiet. Someone scoffed. "You think a 16-year-old figured out something the rest of us missed?" Frank rubbed his chin. "I think he's either dead wrong or dead serious." That was the first crock. Not in the building, in the town. Certainty. Ethan felt the shift, even if no one said anything to him directly. People watched more closely now, less mocking, more measuring. He worked longer hours, cut back on sleep. His movements grew sharper, more urgent. He didn't talk about what he felt building in the air, how the wind seemed heavier lately, how the silence before storms lingered longer than it should. He just kept shaping wood into curves and hoping the world would give him enough time to finish. Because deep down, Ethan wasn't afraid of being laughed at anymore. He was afraid of being too late. And as October bled into November, Pine Ridge Hollow continued on as it always had, unaware that the ground beneath its certainty was already starting to shift. November arrived without asking permission. It slipped into Pine Ridge Hollow quietly, the way trouble often does. No storms, no sirens, just a subtle shift in the air that most people didn't notice because they weren't looking for it. Ethan noticed. He felt it first in his ears, a dull pressure that came and went without warning. He noticed it in the way the wind behaved, not stronger but stranger. It didn't rush through the valley like it used to. It lingered, circled, slid along the ridges as if testing the land. The birds noticed too. One morning, Ethan stepped outside his trailer and realized how quiet it was. No crows arguing in the trees, no distant rustle of wings, just stillness. Thick, uneasy stillness. He pulled one of his father's notebooks from his jacket pocket and flipped to a page he'd marked months earlier. Rapid pressure change, unseasonal warmth followed by sharp cold, silence before violent rotation. Ethan closed the notebook and looked up at the sky. It didn't look wrong yet. That was what scared him most. At school, teachers complained about students losing focus. At the gas station, people mentioned headaches, restless sleep, dogs barking at nothing. Small things, easy to ignore. Ethan couldn't ignore them. He worked faster now. The curved walls of the shelter were nearly complete, rising solid and smooth from the earth. The structure no longer looked like a joke. It looked intentional, thoughtful, permanent. Still unfinished, but close. That closeness haunted him. One afternoon, Lucas Reed found Ethan sitting on a stack of lumber, staring at the sky instead of working. "You all right?" Lucas asked. Ethan nodded slowly. "Do you feel that?" Lucas frowned. "Feel what?" Ethan struggled to explain. "Like the air's waiting?" Lucas laughed uneasily. "You've been spending too much time alone, man." "Maybe," Ethan said, but he didn't smile. That same evening, Ethan walked into town for supplies. The trading post buzzed with early winter talk: salt, firewood, heating oil. Life going on the way it always had. Frank Miller stood near the counter talking with a few men. "Never seen November this warm," one said. Frank shrugged. "Weather's been weird for years now." Another man laughed. "Don't tell that to the kid building the round bunker. He'll say it's the end of the world." A few chuckles followed. Ethan stopped in the doorway. Frank noticed him and cleared his throat. "Evening, Ethan?" "Evening," Ethan replied. There was an awkward pause. Frank shifted his weight. "You, making good progress out there?" "Yes, sir." Frank hesitated, then surprised everyone, including himself. "You think winter's going to be rough?" Ethan looked him in the eye. "I think winter won't be the problem." The room fell quiet. Frank forced a laugh. "Well, that's comforting." Ethan didn't stay long after that. That night he dreamed of wind. Not sound, not movement, but pressure. A crushing force with no face, no direction. He woke before dawn, heart pounding, the words from his notebook echoing in his mind. Rotation doesn't announce itself. The next few days brought more signs. Clouds stretched into long, unnatural bands across the sky, like someone had dragged fingers through wet paint. The light took on a pale greenish tint in the afternoons that made shadows look sickly and wrong. Old Mrs. Harper swore her arthritis was acting up worse than ever. Dogs whined through the night. Even Frank admitted his workshop doors rattled when there was no wind. Still, no one said the word, storm. Ethan finished the roof framework just as the temperature dropped sharply. One day it was mild enough to work in a flannel shirt. The next frost clung to the ground before sunrise. The shift was violent, unnatural. Ethan climbed onto the roof to secure the lost support beam, his breath fogging in the cold air. From that height, he could see the whole town. Rows of square houses, straight lines, right angles, comforting shapes, fragile shapes. Lucas stood below watching. "You sure you don't want help?" he called up. Ethan shook his head. "I need it done a certain way." Lucas nodded, though he didn't fully understand. "People are nervous," he said. "They don't know why." Ethan tightened a bolt. "Neither do I. I just know it's coming." Lucas swallowed. "Coming how?" Ethan climbed down slowly, his movements careful. Fast. The next morning, the birds were gone completely. Not quiet. Gone. Ethan stood outside his shelter, scanning the tree line. His skin prickled. He grabbed his notebook again, flipping pages with shaking fingers. Then he saw it. The clouds weren't drifting anymore. They were stacking, layer upon layer, moving in different directions at once. Low clouds raced beneath higher ones, twisting the sky into something that didn't belong over Pine Ridge Hollow. Ethan felt fear that, not panic, but a deep, grounded certainty. This wasn't a storm that passed. This was a storm that chose. He ran, not away, but toward his shelter. As he worked, hammering, securing, sealing every seam, the first low thunder rolled across the valley. It didn't sound like thunder. It sounded like something heavy being dragged across the earth. Lucas appeared again, breathless. "Ethan, Frank says the pressure dropped like a rock. People are starting to worry." Ethan didn't stop working. "They should." Lucas stared at him. "Should we tell people too?"
A sudden gust cut him off, ripping loose leaves into the air. Ethan looked up at the sky, now bruised purple and green. "It's too late to tell them what to think," he said quietly. "All we can do now is be ready." The wind shifted again, stronger this time, and somewhere far off beyond the ridges, something began to move. At 3:42 p.m., the wind changed, not gradually, not politely. It snapped like a rope pulled tight and suddenly cut loose. Ethan felt it in his bones before he saw anything, a violent shift in pressure that made his ears ring and, pounding, his chest feel hollow as if the air had been scooped out of him. He froze for half a second, standing outside the shelter, staring at the sky that had turned an unnatural shade of green-gray. This was it. He didn't think he moved. "Lucas," Ethan shouted, already running. "Get inside." Lucas stood 20 yards away, eyes locked on the western ridge. "Ethan, what the hell is that?" The sound reached them before the sight did. A low roar, distant but growing fast, like a freight train barreling through the mountains with nowhere to stop. Ethan grabbed Lucas by the arm and dragged him toward the shelter. "Don't look at it. Move." The first debris hit the ground hard enough to shake their feet. Leaves, dirt, broken branches. Everything lifted and twisted in the air like the land itself had turned against them. It crossed Pine Ridge Hollow. People poured out of their homes in confusion and fear. Frank Miller burst from his workshop, wiping his hands on his jeans, squinting at the sky. "That ain't right," he muttered. Someone screamed, and then they saw it. The funnel dropped from the clouds like a living thing. Dark, massive, spinning with a terrifying purpose. It wasn't thin or elegant like the ones on television. This one was wide, heavy, hungry. A tornado in November in the mountains. The rules people trusted shattered in that instant. "Get to the church," someone yelled. "Basements," another screamed. "Run." Panic spread faster than the storm itself. Ethan shoved Lucas through the round doorway and slammed it shut behind them. The wind hit the shelter like a wall of fists, but instead of crashing, it slid, screamed around the curved exterior. Lucas stumbled inside, eyes wide, breathing hard.
"Ethan, this thing." "I know," Ethan said, forcing the door latch into place. His hands shook, but his movements were steady. "Just stay low." The roar intensified, swallowing every other sound. Wood splintered somewhere nearby. A sharp croak echoed, followed by a deep, gut-wrenching boom. Outside, Pine Ridge Hollow was coming apart. Frank Miller's workshop lifted from its foundation as if it weighed nothing. Walls peeled away, boards tearing loose and spinning into the sky like matchsticks. A pickup truck flipped end over end, disappearing into the storm. The church bell rang once, then went silent. Inside the shelter, the air vibrated. The walls groaned, flexing under pressure that no straight structure could have survived. Dust rained down from the ceiling. The floor trembled beneath their feet. Lucas covered his head, yelling something Ethan couldn't hear. Ethan pressed his palms against the curved wall, eyes closed, heart hammering. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to do something, but there was nothing left to do now. This was the test. The wind circled the shelter, furious, relentless. It searched for corners, edges, weaknesses. There were none. The force slid around the structure, wrapping and unwrapping itself, unable to grab hold. The curved walls redirected the pressure, spreading it evenly instead of letting it concentrate and tear the building apart. Ethan felt it, felt the theory become reality. Then came the worst moment. A sudden impact slammed into the door hard enough to throw both of them to the floor. The latch rattled violently. The shelter shuddered. Lucas screamed. Ethan lunged forward, bracing his shoulder against the door. He could hear debris striking it. Metal, wood, God knows what, hammering again and again. "Hold," Ethan shouted, though he didn't know who he was talking to. Himself, the building, the universe. Seconds stretched into something else, something endless. Ethan opened his eyes. His ears rang. His body felt hollow, light. He waited, afraid to move, afraid the storm was just catching its breath. But it didn't come back. Slowly, carefully, Ethan stood. The shelter was still there, the walls still curved, the roof still intact. Lucas stared at him, disbelief etched across his face. "Are we alive?" Ethan nodded, throat tight. "Yeah." They waited another minute before Ethan unlatched the door. It took effort to push it open. What greeted them outside didn't feel real. Pine Ridge Hollow was gone. Not damaged, not scattered. Gone. The tornado had carved a path straight through the town,
leaving bare earth and twisted debris where houses once stood. Foundations were exposed like bones. Trees were snapped or stripped clean, their bark torn away. Frank Miller's workshop was nowhere to be seen. The gas station gone. The church reduced to rubble. Ethan stepped out slowly, his legs weak. People emerged from ditches, from behind rocks, from wherever they'd managed to survive. Some were bleeding, some were crying, some just stood there staring, unable to process what they were seeing. Frank Miller staggered toward them, a cut on his forehead, eyes wild. He stopped short when he saw the shelter, standing untouched. "How?" Frank whispered, his voice cracked. "How is this still here?" Ethan looked at the curved walls, at the door that had held. "Because the wind couldn't grab it," he said quietly. Frank reached out, touching the wall as if expecting it to vanish. "All these years," he murmured. "All these damn years building square, thinking stronger meant thicker." His eyes filled with tears. "And the kid we laughed at." More survivors gathered, drawn to the only structure left standing. They pressed close, not just for safety, but for understanding. Ethan didn't feel victorious. He felt hollow, because being right had come at a cost no one should have had to pay. The sky slowly cleared as evening approached, sunlight breaking through the torn clouds and casting long shadows across the ruins of Pine Ridge Hollow. And in the center of it all stood a curved shelter built by a 16-year-old boy who had listened when the world tried to warn him, while everyone else was too busy laughing. The silence after the storm was worse than the noise. It pressed down on Pine Ridge Hollow like a heavy blanket, thick with dust and disbelief. No wind, no birds, just the crackle of distant fires and the soft, broken sounds of people trying to breathe through shock. Ethan stood outside the shelter, staring at what used to be his town. He had imagined this moment before, had imagined proof, validation, the quiet satisfaction of being right. What he felt instead was grief. People moved like ghosts through the wreckage, stepping carefully, afraid the ground itself might give way. Some called out names, others didn't speak at all. A few simply sat down where their homes had been and stared at nothing. Lucas emerged from the shelter behind him, his face pale. "I keep thinking it's going to start again," he said. Ethan nodded. "Me too." Word spread quickly that the curved shelter was intact. Survivors drifted toward it, one by one at first, then in clusters, drawn not just by safety, but by something they didn't yet understand. By nightfall, more than a dozen people had gathered around it. Frank Miller sat on a fallen beam nearby, his head in his hands. When Ethan approached, Frank looked up, eyes red and unfocused. "I spent 40 years building things I thought were solid," Frank said hoarsely. "Taught my boy the same way. Taught everyone." He swallowed hard. "I laughed at you." Ethan didn't know what to say. He hadn't prepared for this part. "You couldn't have known," he finally said. Frank shook his head. "You knew enough." A woman named Sarah, who had lost her house and nearly lost her husband, stood nearby listening. "Why didn't you tell us harder?" she asked, not accusing, just broken. Ethan felt the weight of the question settle on his chest. "I tried," he said quietly, "but people don't hear warnings that don't fit the world they're used to." No one argued with that. As the temperature dropped, Ethan opened the shelter to everyone. The interior was cramped but warm. The curved walls seemed to hold the heat close, wrapping the space in a steady, even comfort that felt almost unreal after what they'd been through. People pressed together, strangers who had lived side by side for years but never truly seen one another. Fear stripped away distance, loss stripped away pride. A child began to cry softly. Someone hummed to calm her. Frank watched the way the heat moved, the way no corner stayed cold, the way the shelter breathed instead of fought the air. "It's different," he murmured. Ethan nodded. "Different doesn't mean fragile." Outside, emergency lights flickered as county crews finally reached the valley. Radios crackled with stunned voices reporting damage that didn't make sense. A tornado in November in the mountains? Experts would explain it later. Charts and probabilities would try to make it understandable. None of that mattered right now. What mattered was survival. The next morning, sunlight revealed the full scope of the destruction. The tornado's path cut clean and brutal through Pine Ridge Hollow, sparing almost nothing. Square houses had collapsed inward, roofs were gone, walls torn open. The shelter stood alone, curved and calm like it had always belonged there. People gathered around it again, touching the walls, running hands along the smooth arcs as if confirming it was real. Lucas watched Ethan from a distance. "They're looking at you like you've got answers," Ethan sighed. "I don't have answers, just observations." "Sometimes that's enough," Lucas said. Frank approached again, this time with purpose in his step. "Show me," he said. "Show you what? How you built it," Frank replied. "The steam box, the curves, the measurements, all of it." Ethan hesitated. "Why?" Frank's voice broke. "Because I don't want to bury anyone else for the same mistake." That was when something shifted, not just in Frank, but in the town. Rebuilding didn't start with hammers and nails. It started with questions. Why did corners fail first? Why did the wind slide instead of slam? Why had strength been confused with stiffness for so long? Ethan answered what he could. When he didn't know, he said so. He pulled out his father's notebooks, spreading them on a makeshift table, explaining sketches in plain language. No lectures, no "I told you so," just shared understanding. Some people resisted. They clung to what was familiar, even after watching it fail. Ethan didn't push them. He understood fear well enough to respect it. But others listened. Frank became his shadow, asking questions late into the night, practicing bending wood the way Ethan showed him. Lucas helped gather materials. Neighbors who had never spoken more than a nod now worked side by side. The shelter wasn't just a building anymore. It was a gathering point, a classroom, a reminder. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridgeline, Sarah approached Ethan again. "You saved my kids," she said softly. Ethan shook his head. "I just built a thing." She met his eyes. "You built a chance." That stayed with him. For the first time since his parents died, Ethan felt something unfamiliar take root beneath the grief and exhaustion. Belonging. Not because he was right, but because he was useful. The town that had once whispered about him now watched closely, not with mockery, but with respect mixed with regret. They didn't see a strange kid anymore. They saw someone who had paid attention when it mattered. And as plans for rebuilding slowly took shape, one truth settled deep into Pine Ridge Hollow. The storm hadn't just torn their town apart, it had exposed the cracks in the way they thought. And in those cracks, something new was beginning to grow.